Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar, the first in our Transportation Tuesdays webinar series. My name is Alex Waltz. I'm a senior planner here at RTA, and the title for today's webinar is Centering the Transit-Dependent COVID-19's Impact on Transit-Oriented Development. So we'll talk a little bit about transit ridership, a little bit about transit-oriented development, and we have 5 panelists today representing all different parts of the region and different representing both local government, economic development corporations, and nonprofits as well. So we're really excited to get started. So before we really get too far into the discussion, I wanted to introduce our panelists for today. You can see their pictures here on the screen right now. And so starting with Scott, I'll ask each of the panelists just to introduce themselves, say your name, your title, and who you're representing today.
Good afternoon. My name is Scott Corin. I'm the city manager for the city of Highwood.
Great, thanks, Scott. Molly?
Hello, everybody. I'm Molly Eckert. I work on the development team at Preservation of Affordable Housing. We're an affordable housing developer, owner, and manager based here, based in Boston, but we have a big portfolio in Chicago.
Great, thanks, Molly. Nick? I think you're muted, Nick.
Excuse me. Nick Reifer, I'm the Economic Development Director for the City of Harvey.
Great, thanks, Nick. To Carrie?
I'm Carrie Haberstich, and I'm Planning Supervisor for the Village of Skokie.
Thanks, Carrie. And last, certainly not least, Carlos.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carlos Nelson, Chief Executive Officer of the Greater Auburn Gresham Development Corporation, a CDC on the Chicago South Side that does comprehensive community development work.
Thanks, everyone. So those are our esteemed panelists. We'll be hearing from them a little bit more later. The bulk of this webinar, excuse me, will be a discussion. But I wanted to start first just by getting some basic definitions out there, talking a little bit about kind of how we would set the stage for our conversation later. So the focus of today's discussion is on transit-oriented development, and TOD is a general development concept that is focused on mixing uses near transit stations. So these could be train stations or bus stations, and the uses could be residential uses, commercial uses, offices, institutional uses. But the major tenets of transit-oriented development are high density mixed uses near transit stations. And transit-oriented development is also called TOD. So you'll hear us refer to that by that acronym a lot. And one of the other fundamental parts of TOD is a streetscape and roadway network design that prioritizes walking, bicycling, and taking transit. Another aspect of transit-oriented development is seeking a way to distribute the benefits of transit-oriented development equitably, no matter your income, your race, your ethnicity, what country you may come from, your gender, or if you have a disability or not. And this concept is called equitable transit-oriented development. And the city of Chicago has recently released an equitable transit-oriented development policy plan that seeks to prioritize investments and policies that close the socioeconomic gap between communities that have a higher proportion of residents of color compared to those that are majority white. And to talk a little bit about some of the communities that we'll be focusing on today, I just wanted to briefly introduce all of those. So the first community is the Auburn Gresham neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. Between 2010 and 2020, the population did decrease slightly, and currently the community is working on a corridor plan for 79th Street through the RTA's community planning program. In terms of Auburn Gresham's racial and economic demographics, there are more Black residents as a proportion of the whole population living in Auburn Gresham compared to the region as a whole. And a higher share of the households in Auburn Gresham make less than $50,000 a year compared to the city and the region. With regards to vehicle availability and how people get to work, there are fewer vehicles available in households in the community compared to the city and the region, and more people in Auburn Gresham take transit compared to the region, but less of them compared to the city. The next community that we're talking about today is the city of Harvey, which is a south suburb located on the Metro Electric District line. Population between 2010 and 2020 did decrease close to 20%. And right now, the city has recently finished a transit-oriented development plan update that was completed through the RTA's community planning program. And you can see an image from that plan update depicted on the screen here. In terms of Harvey's racial and economic demographics, Harvey has a higher share of residents who are Black compared to Cook County and the CMAP region. And there's a larger share of households that are earning less than $50,000 a year compared to Cook County and the region more generally. With regards to vehicle availability and how people get to work in Harvey, Harvey has similar vehicle availability compared to Cook County and the region, but fewer people in Harvey take transit compared to the county and the region. The next community that we're talking about today is the city of Highwood, which is a north suburb located along the Union Pacific North Metro line. Between 2010 and 2020, population did decrease slightly, and the most recent projects that the city completed through the RTA's community planning program was a transit-oriented development plan and zoning code updates that were completed in 2013 and 2015, respectively. In terms of Highwood's racial and economic demographics, Highwood has a larger proportion of Latino residents compared to Lake County and the region, and also has a larger share of households that are making less than $50,000 a year compared to Lake County and the region. But in terms of vehicle availability and use of transit to get to work, Highwood has similar levels of vehicle availability compared to Lake County and the region, but more people in Highwood take transit compared to Lake County, although this is less than the average resident in the region takes transit. The last community that we're talking about today is the village of Skokie, which is north of Chicago and is connected to the CTA rail system. In contrast, to some of the other communities that we're talking about today, population increased between 2010 and 2020. And the most recent project that the village completed through the RTA's community planning program was a developer discussion panel back in 2015. Skokie's racial and economic demographics are shown here in the tables on the screen. Skokie has overall a larger proportion of Asian residents compared to Cook County and the region, and the income distribution in the village is roughly equivalent to Cook County and the region more generally. Skokie has similar levels of vehicle availability, although there are slightly more households that have vehicles available compared to Cook County when you compare that to the region, but fewer people in Skokie take transit to work compared to the county and the region. The other organization that we're talking about today is a nonprofit called the Preservation of Affordable Housing, and their specialty is preserving existing affordable housing that is at risk of being lost due to market pressures or physical deterioration, but they also have experience in new construction of neighborhood scale mixed income developments. And you can see one example of one of their properties in the Chicago region depicted in this image on the right, which is in the Woodlawn neighborhood of Chicago. Preservation of affordable housing, or as most people call it, POA, has a national footprint, if you will, but they do have a really sizable presence here in Illinois. And you can see some of their projects in Northeast Illinois depicted on the screen here. Coincidentally, some of their properties are located in Harvey. So one of the major things that we noticed from the COVID-19 pandemic was a significant decline in transit ridership. This was throughout the country, throughout the region, and even in the city of Chicago, transit ridership declined dramatically. But these ridership declines weren't necessarily uniform across all neighborhoods, across all communities. And one of the things that we saw is that, in general, transit ridership declined less in communities that had more Black residents and more Hispanic residents compared to communities that had more white residents. So you can see this in the city of Chicago using CTA rail ridership numbers depicted in this map. And so you can see that particularly on the city's west and south sides, transit ridership declined less than the RTA system overall. So all of the dark blue dots here represent CTA rail stations where transit ridership was 5% greater compared to the RTA system overall. You can also see that put against a background of the racial demographics of census blocks throughout the region. This trend held true for most of the services under the RTA's purview. But one thing that's notable about ridership numbers, and this is just a snapshot in time from 2019 to 2021, one of the things that you can see here is that bus ridership tended to decrease less than rail ridership did over that period of time. And this is also reflected when you drill down a little bit more into ridership numbers for the communities that we're talking about today. So you can see ridership values for PACE and CTA and Metro Rail routes and lines depicted on this table here. So this is only showing weekdays in May, but you can see that in general, most of the bus routes in these communities outperformed the RTA system average. And this is the same for Highwood and Skokie generally. And mostly what we saw is that bus routes decreased less than some of the other types of transit in terms of ridership. So just to sum up those takeaways, we noticed that ridership declined dramatically throughout the system, but that these changes weren't necessarily uniform. And so we noticed that most generally, bus service tended to outperform the RTA system average over this time. And we noticed that, and our inference basically from this ridership data is that the communities that we're talking about today retained more riders than the system overall, highlighting that residents in these communities rely on transit to a greater degree than the region in general. So now we'll move into our panel discussion. Thanks for your attention on that. I know there's a lot of information thrown out at you pretty fast, but we're going to move into our panel discussion and we'll focus on some of these questions, some of these topics throughout the discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see all of our panelists. And we'll start with a very basic question to any of the panelists. How have you changed the way you approach transit-oriented development since the pandemic began? So kind of as an extension of that, because ridership declined so drastically, are you more wary of pursuing transit-oriented development, or does it remain a viable and desired development form despite these declines in ridership?
I guess I'll take an initial stab and then pass it over to Nick. It sounds like Nick had something to share. So once again, Carlos Nelson, Greater Auburn Gresham Development Corporation. We service a large swath of the South Side and we reside in Auburn Gresham. But I will say for us, you know, the term TOD or transit-oriented development isn't a common household theme. One of the things that we are doing is really looking to educate the residents, inform the residents, so that more people are familiar with what that term means. For leaders in Auburn Gresham, certainly at GAGDC, access to transportation, access to transit is one of the great equalizers. And in order to utilize that great equalizer, residents need to feel comfortable, need to feel like they can, walk without concern for, physical harm, et cetera, to the variety of transit options that we have. And so to that end, making Auburn Gresham and the greater Auburn Gresham community a pedestrian friendly community is something that we are working really hard as we actually build out, and I'll talk more later, many of significant catalytic projects in Auburn Gresham housed right around the new metro station, Rock Island Metro Station, that is coming online at 79th Street.
So Alex, I would just say in the city of Harvey, we are definitely remain committed to TOD as a development strategy. In fact, we're probably doubling down on it. We have a brand new TOD plan that was referenced earlier, just adopted a couple months ago. Very excited to have worked with Michael Horsting at RTA and many other stakeholders. And I think Pete Costa is on this call. He helped us out in that. So very much committed to it in the short term and in the long term. And in fact, we are starting to execute on the TOD strategy in spite of all the headwinds we've faced over the past 2 years with COVID.
I would say Skokie, we haven't really changed our approach to transit-oriented development, and actually there is redevelopment interest near our Oakton and Skokie stations. So I'm not weary at this point, and I think just the concept of transit-oriented development, there, especially with rail, that there's a significant investment, and so it's hard to just kind of pick the rails up and move them over. So there's there's a big enough investment that I'm not wary at this point.
For the city of Highwood, even though ridership numbers might be down temporarily, we found that the pandemic has shown that there's been still very strong housing demand and a lack of supply to do that. And transit, I think, has commonly brought a sense of place to a community, and people want that sense of place throughout the pandemic. You're spending more time at home, you're doing things. I think the TOD model has really proven to be a great way for people to live long term, and people are seeing more value in that, even if they're not necessarily traveling as much every day on public transportation.
Would agree as well from a development perspective, along with Carlos, that we don't like, we're talking about TD doesn't always translate, but people want, and as Scott said, people want to live in vibrant places. They want to live where the established schools are, where the restaurants and shops are, and those are those transit rich locations. And so we've always made that a priority in terms of development opportunities, and continue to double down on that. And in fact, the map you showed with how ridership just was stable through the pandemic, I mean, it's perverse that, especially in the city of Chicago, and a lot of people recognize that, and there's a lot of great initiatives to draw attention to it that Carlos is a part of, and we work with Elevated Chicago and working on really important underlying zoning changes, but that the transit-oriented development that we've seen in the city has benefited high-income renters and high-income owners, and really not the people that need and depend on housing or transit the most, and people that need options. So as an affordable housing developer, it's paramount to us. And it would agree with a lot of the same things, want people to be able to feel safe using it, and feel safe walking to it, and all the things.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I wanted to pick up on something that Carlos alluded to. So the concept and the term transit-oriented development is kind of old hat for people who are in the planning field, but it's not necessarily something that we talk about in general. So I'm wondering, do residents really have an understanding of TOD, even if they don't know of it by that name? Like, how do you describe new TOD projects, and what concerns do residents bring to you about new TOD projects?
So, and as Molly mentioned, so equity, really looking at through a lens of equity is so vitally important for us on Chicago's South Side to talk about, in partnership with many, great organizations on the city, to talk about equitable transit-oriented development. Yet there has been a Metro Rock Island line that intersects 79th Street, the busiest bus line in the entire city of Chicago system, and yet there's not been a way to make that connection for families in our communities. I mean, we're not really practicing what we preach, and so thankfully, and it's been a long, hard fight, Alex, to get this metro station, the Auburn Park station, to open up. It's under construction now. It was a long, hard fight from, it's been at least 20 years now. And so unless we start really showing that there's equity, to the around the development projects and the planning, and thankfully we've got Michael Horsting and the RTA team now, working with a working with community residents on a planning study so that more residents can really, digest what it means to be equitably transit-oriented development. I think, uh, in a year, in 2 years, once the metro is open, once residents are more familiar and more informed, I think that the efficiencies that are afforded by improved access to transit will reap benefits on our community.
I would just say, like, we do a survey a lot of times before we start a development project. Most of PO is a preservation development. So a lot of times we're buying existing properties and renovating them, which means that they could be in really great transit-rich locations, or they could have been built on the highway and sort of transit deserts, and we're kind of stuck with what we've, a lot of places with a highway view, but like in a lot of places we work, they're transit rich, and we'll do a survey of residents, and it's always, it's everything is location, location, location. And so a lot of times, what is your favorite thing about this development? It's the bus, it's the train, it's the access that it affords. So I think we all have a really strong sense that that's part of people's what people value in housing.
Thanks everyone. I wanted to just remind people in the audience, you're welcome to submit questions via the chat box. We're going to set aside time towards the end, about 20 minutes or so, for questions and answers from the audience. So if you have a question that comes to mind, feel free to put it in the chat, and either somebody who's monitoring the chat, my colleagues, will respond to you immediately in the chat if the question lends itself to that. Otherwise, we'll save it and get back to it later on. I wanted to pull back a little bit and kind of from a higher view, if you will, as it relates to transit-oriented development. What do you view as a higher priority? Initiating land use change or bringing about changes to the transportation infrastructure? So do you try and target maybe a new land use plan, changing the zoning, or are you more focused on developing improvements to the transportation network as a means of attracting new transit-oriented development?
Here in the city of Highwood, we've been fortunate to have opportunity where we can amend the zoning code following our comprehensive plan, and we worked with the RTA to put together a downtown projects guidebook, and that really allowed us to take advantage of the train line that's been here for 100 years, but we needed to update our own plans and processes to the economics of 2020 and 2022 in order to make these things work. And it did work. After 20 to 30 years of disinvestment and a lack of investment, that's really turned things around. With the transportation infrastructure, we really need to work with our long-term partners and those with the resources to be able to do that, like the RTA, to work on that transportation. So I feel like we'd be more the tail wagging the dog for that. What's nice for us smaller communities is we do have more control over that, and we can be more adaptable. So that's what's been more successful here for us.
So Alex, I would say it's not an either or. I think it's yes in both. I think that we are pursuing land use change and transportation infrastructure change. In fact, our new TOD plan calls for certain investments to improve and enhance our transportation infrastructure. So it puts us in a good position having the TOD plan in place to really work with PACE and Metro, which is contemplating additional improvements to our downtown transit center. So I think they both kind of go hand in hand.
I like the way Nick put it, because I was going to say chicken and the egg. Pick one. I think from Skokie's experience, especially with the Oakton Skokie station, that was actually opened 10 years ago, just last month, or actually at the end of April. There was one there, it was removed, I believe, in the 60s, and then it finally came back. And so I guess kind of using that as an example, transportation was probably a big factor in the Illinois Science and Technology Park investment by an out-of-state investor. So, I mean, transportation, I would say, is probably more difficult to implement, especially if you have to do right-of-way purchase and that sort of thing. Fortunately, the right-of-way was there, so it made it less difficult. But yeah, I'd say they both need to coexist to make it work.
And I'd like to piggyback on what Carrie said, and Nick, it is certainly a both. And but once again, there's been the glaring disinvestment that has occurred on the south side and southland, south suburbs. I mean, it would bring a brass monkey to tears when you think about the fact that there's infrastructure that already exists. There was a train station at that location at 79th and 78th and Fielding, 79th and Low, when the Auburn Gresham community was a predominantly white community. And when the ethnic succession occurred, the station was shuttered. And we've had to fight long and hard to get that station reopened. When you consider the fact that the Red Line extension, the Dan Ryanell, has stopped at 95th Street when it was planned to extend deeper toward the Southland, and that still has not happened. And we're fighting, very hard to get the Red Line extension project adopted. When you think about the infrastructure of the Metro Electric line that serves Harvey and a large area of low income members of the community, folks that have little access to or low access to employment, and it's just now getting the juices flowing to utilizing or discussing making that a rapid transit to downtown. I mean, there's so much as it relates to the infrastructure that goes back to the disinvestment and disregard on our South Side and Southland communities. So with that, and the need to address the land use is essential. So I'll pause there.
Thanks, everybody. And I wanted to kind of continue that line of conversation as it relates to disinvestment. And Scott touched on that as well. Following a long period of disinvestment, generally, how do you try and attract new development? What things are you doing right now to try and attract new development? What do you think has worked in the past? What would you like to see more of? I was hoping to explore that a little bit more.
For the city of Highwood, it took, we needed to use every department in every way to solve this. A big step for us was passing a downtown TIF district that allowed us to make some of the public infrastructure, the streetscape improvements that made some of those areas more successful. One thing that we did have to our benefit is we had such a strong restaurant population in Highwood already, and that's trended well for us. And I think in most communities with a good restaurant scene in the last 20 years, as that's trended better, we've been fortunate to take advantage of that. Another area where things have trended well in our favor is we're a very dense community, very housing dense compared with many of our neighbors. And over the past 20 years, as people have looked to get away from the sprawling estates and larger homes and get into denser, more walkable, more friendly areas, adding that public investment has really helped just snowball and make Highwood a more attractive place to invest in. But even still with that, we've needed to find the people that have the money to do this, are willing to pay for development and investment. And it did take a long time. We've had to prove that the rents would make it work for market rate type apartments. And those things can quickly swing now too, where as you do start to develop, you need to make sure that you're finding affordable housing and maintaining that throughout the community too. So it's a real difficult balance, investing on all sides. So you make sure that you have a mix of both incentives to invest in the community and get rid of blight and vacancies, but then also make sure that you're maintaining the community character that you want and making sure that you're a good long-term home for long-time residents.
And Alex, I would just add to what Scott said. Sometimes the public sector has to be the one to invest first after a long period disinvestment. Sometimes the public sector has to step forward, and that means grants, means investing in our downtown Harvey Transit Center. It could mean investing in our other metro station. Could also mean working with IDA on grants. And so, that's the big investment going on right now is with POA, who's on this panel. They are investing in their own facility, a really nice building, the former YMCA building. That's actually one of the biggest and kind of an anchor building for our downtown that they're reinvesting in with the help of IDA grant assistance. And then we're pursuing another IDA funded project using federal tax credits. So those two things plus reinvestment in the Harvey Transit Center will really create some positive momentum for our downtown. And that's all under the umbrella of our new TOD plan, by the way. And then also, TIF, Scott mentioned TIF. We're not afraid of TIF. We try to be judicious users of that tool. It's a financing tool that has been kind of loved to death in Chicago. And but I think it's a positive tool when it's used correctly, judiciously, and that's what we're trying to do. In fact, we have a new TOD TIF district that will really follow the boundaries of the TOD plan for the most part.
And just to jump in for people who don't know what TIF is, it stands for Tax Increment Financing District. And so what TIF does is it allows you to freeze the taxes in a particular area, put all of that money in essentially like an escrow account, and then reinvest those funds back into the district after the TIF period has ended.
And just from a developer perspective, I would absolutely like to recognize public sector because they are a leader in terms of reinvesting in transit-oriented areas. Nick and his team at the City of Harvey have been wonderful to work with. I don't work on that project directly, but I know a lot of my colleagues are singing your praises and your leadership. Just that, I mean, the reason I said earlier that the kind of luxury housing gets built in these TOD locations is because they can charge, $2,500 for a 1-bedroom apartment, and we can't. And so and just recognizing to get anything that you want, even just a vanilla apartment building, that the costs are so much higher, the land costs are higher, the logistical costs, the demo costs. I think for the Woodlawn Station, that project that you put up with the kind of beautiful red siding, it's at the terminus of the Green Line in Woodlawn at the Cottage Grove Station, required relocating all kinds of AT&T lines and CTA things and working on their property. So that those projects carry a premium. And so just like the public sector stepping up to work to grants, loans, aggressively land banking, land near transit, recognizing the priority for funding, especially IDA, especially the City of Chicago awarding points for projects located near transit and good locations is essential to getting good projects with great access.
And Alex, and I would say, I'm sorry if I.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Carrie. I've spoken enough. Go ahead, Carrie.
I was just going to say, Skokie has a wonderful economic development staff, and we've used TIF as tools. We've also purchased property, which is helping developer interest in a few properties near our Oakton and Skokie stations. So kind of echoing comments already made.
And I was just going to mention, there is a movement certainly happening in Auburn Gresham, and the public sector took note that this movement was really generated from the community, utilizing a community ownership model, community wealth building. So, so if we stick a pin at the 79th and Low station where the Metro will be opening up in the next couple of years, and, right within a half-mile, 3/4 mile radius, GAGDC's Auburn Gresham Healthy Lifestyle Hub is going to be opening up actually next month, a 60,000 square foot redevelopment project anchored by a full service health and wellness center. We'll have a pharmacy, we'll have restaurants, we're going to have office spaces. The Chicago Bears have invested in Justin Fields, promised to come out and celebrate with us. But that was a community-led project through a community quality of life planning process. This project won $10 million from the Pritzker Traubert Foundation, and our second partner project is so our project, $20 million, the Healthy Lifestyle Hub, opening up in July, opening up a couple of months later. It's a renewable energy and urban farming campus right at the embankment of the Rock Island, that same Rock Island line, a $40 million project that we're a principal investor in. Both of those projects will bring nearly 200 living wage jobs right around this new metro station. So those type of capital investment projects, were taken notice by the city of Chicago and the mayor's Invest Southwest initiative. And so the Invest Southwest projects Commissioner Cox wanted to be as close to these projects as he possibly could. So the city is building, I think they're investing about $50 million in 2 affordable housing units, bringing 60 plus residents right to that same radius. And so, this confluence of investment initially generated by the residents, the community, and that layered on by public and now private investors is a recipe for success. And so we're looking to replicate that throughout Southside and the Southland.
Great, thanks everyone. I wanted to kind of follow that thread a little bit more, taking it a little bit back to what we talked about in terms of equitable transit-oriented development. One thing that some communities do is enter into community benefits agreements with large projects to make sure that the community gets certain benefits from that project. So I'm wondering, have you done those types of negotiations before? What do you typically ask of developers to do? And how do you think you try and distribute the benefits of transit-oriented development projects throughout the community?
Well, I'll take a stab at answering that, Alex. Community benefit agreements are often baked into a larger redevelopment agreement. In fact, you often get leverage as a city or village if you have incentives of a redevelopment agreement. Then the city and village can ask for certain things to benefit the community, hence the community benefit agreement. So, those are things that we will have looked at, we'll continue to look at. Job fairs, encouraging local hiring for certain. That's something we would look at. The other thing that might not be so obvious is broadband. We happen to have done right before our TOD plan, a broadband strategic plan financed through the Illinois Office of Broadband. So we, as part of the Harvey Lofts project that's about to break ground in late July, they are going to agree to basically ensure broadband for every unit in that building. So that's not a hard lift for them. I think they want to provide broadband. It's no longer an amenity, as everyone knows, through COVID. It's a necessity for daily living. So that really does, though, have an equity component to it, because unfortunately there is in rural areas as well as in Harvey, a lot of people that just don't have broadband, or they rely too much on their cell phone when they, most times people need broadband to the home. So that's something that we'll be looking at, especially as we do more residential projects.
Thanks, Vic. I wanted to step back and do a little bit more of a general question. In terms of what you hear from residents or communities that you work with, what types of developments do residents and communities seem most interested in? Do they have any common features like public green space or restaurants? And what size of building or what level of density do you think is most popular based on what you hear from people that you work with or residents that you speak to?
So I'll jump in here. So I referenced a planning process, a quality of life planning process, and we actually concluded our most recent one in 2017, I believe it is. So, we're actually, we've captured the voices, the thoughts, the ideas of 1,500 residents through a visioning session, through plans to improve the qualities of life of the residents. And so many of the actions that I described, the development that I've talked about, were in this quality of life plan, but some of them really specifically called out, we need more healthy living resources. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, and I'll see a lot of heads, nodding. Access to healthy food. COVID just really shined a light on this food instability issue here in our communities. Financial stability was something that resonated. And I mentioned wealth generation and wealth building. We had no access to banks. We've got a Bank of America coming into our Healthy Lifestyle Hub. Job readiness and access to jobs. Economic, at the crux of all of this, economic development. And taking the inordinate number of vacant lots and vacant buildings and seeing them as opportunities, and repurposing the vacant buildings where we can, and redeveloping on those vacant lots, really through a lens of community ownership. And I think that's the key. And so there's such, and you may even ask this question about gentrification, so maybe I'll pause there. But those are some of the things that residents really ask for, and I think it's important. We have to listen to the residents in our community. And then Nick did mention something I had on my notes. Broadband, internet connectivity is a key aspect of infrastructure in communities that we don't always think about. And so that's something else that we're working to establish on Chicago's South Side.
One of the big challenges we faced, and it's important to have items that are going to be popular enough so they get approved ultimately through your process. But I think it's also really important as a staff member to try to help guide what's economically feasible as well. Something that's been very common the past 10 to 15 years or so has been a real desire for small scale retail to come back. And I think I can confidently say at this point, it's probably not coming back in any type of a real way. So when you're trying to develop, sometimes the housing supply issues that we need to add more housing supply, and we need less small storefront retail. So trying to help work on some of those competing priorities for what's popular and what's needed within a community is important as part of those discussions also.
I would echo that too. I think that's what people connect to in development, whether or not it's economically feasible. I mean, and we've found in that similar way that if you have to subsidize the housing, you have to subsidize the retail. So I think when we talked about our work in Woodlawn, we redeveloped, I think we became associated with transit-oriented development in Chicago because of the work of my colleagues over the last 12 to 14 years to redevelop a former Grove Park Plaza, which was right at the terminus of the Green Line. But it was just housing. There was no mix of any kind of retail there. And it was right at the crossroads of the neighborhood. I mean, the Cottage Grove bus is like has one of the highest ridership in the city, right there at the end of the Green Line, close to the University of Chicago, not far from the Red Line, all of this. But there was, it wasn't the crossroads where people could go to get what they wanted. And so there's a jewel there now. I mean, that's owing to a lot of market loss that had left the neighborhood. So a lot of it is striking that balance, as Scott said, between what's feasible and what you really do need to kind of blood, sweat, and tears to make happen because it needs to be in that neighborhood, I think. But that's the proudest part of that development. I mean, not only is preserving the homes for the people that live there to stay in the neighborhood, but also getting that healthy food there, getting that retail. Another big part of the project right there, Cottage Grove, that red building, was like retail storefronts, and we worked very hard. A lot of my coworkers, Conrad Schlater, Felicia Dawson, Bill Eager, like very carefully to find that right retail mix, to find, as Carlos mentioned, a Black franchisee for UPS, Black-owned restaurants, yoga studio, restaurants that would cater to people, the after church crowd, just because there really is that need. And so I think that's whether or not it's the most economically feasible, but you also want those restaurants and those stores and everything to be there in 5 years, right? Like, so it's a really important piece.
Yeah, I think retail in this environment, maybe even in Skokie and other areas, it's very hard. I just think there's been a massive amount of overbuilding in retail the last 25 years. You go to the ICSC and trade retail shows, they'll tell you that. I think the average in the United States, retail per square foot per American is huge. It's much higher than other countries, and certainly that's true in the Chicago area. So that's the overall environment we're dealing with. And we just have a lot of retail vacancy. And as a result, I think our zoning has to kind of adapt to that market reality. And in fact, one of the things we had to provide was a variance for our Harvey Lofts project to not force them to build retail that will become vacant. So, it's going to be 100% residential as a result, which is a good thing. And that same thing in my prior job in Brookfield, in order to get the project built, they needed some relief, zoning relief in terms of not as much retail. And as a result there too, we got that project built, and it's a nice new multifamily building in downtown Brookfield.
I would say for Skokie, though not TOD specific, vacancy is definitely a concern. We're actually going through a process right now of adjusting our zoning code to allow, we have what we call a retail street requirement, where it has to be shall have first floor retail, primarily within our downtown area, but it also includes the area of our downtown station. But there's demand for office like professional type office uses, and just to help with the vacancy rates, most notably in the downtown, we're looking to adjust the requirements and add a few more office options for developments that aren't on hard corners. So we still want to have the retail that, the corner of First and Main kind of thing, but office where there's not a lot of upfront investment. So it could possibly transition to retail, because that is our main goal, especially in downtown, is to, have that captive audience as you're walking the entire length of downtown, to be a retail mindset, not, break it up with a bank or that sort of thing. So uses such as like dental offices, where there's a lot of upfront costs, that's not included, but, just a professional office, say maybe a real estate company or that sort of thing could be there, but could also easily, move to the second floor of another building or whatnot, in the near-ish future. So that's kind of where Skokie's at.
Thanks, everyone. I'm wondering, so we talked a little bit about how residents think about transit-oriented development, what concerns they might have. How do existing business owners think about TOD? Do you hear that they're generally supportive of it? What do you hear from them when you're embarking on a new project?
Well, I would say existing business owners don't think about TOD. They're thinking about just keeping their doors open. The last 2.5 years has really wreaked havoc on our business owners. But even in spite of that, we are really working hard to cultivate more entrepreneurs, local business owners from the community who, already have a stake in the community, and as an effort to once again build community wealth, which I think is so vitally important. Auburn Gresham is part of that famed Chicago bungalow belt. Beautiful, beautiful rows of brick bungalows and brick 2 flats and, bookend apartment buildings, and maintaining, that home ownership look and feel, while incorporating, new renters who can matriculate into homeowners. That was how the city was laid out for years past, and we want those new business owners to be residents from the community and paint the broader picture of building wealth. But I will tell you right now, there's no consideration of TOD, and maybe as we embark upon this corridor study, we'll try to infuse more knowledge, more education around the importance of transit-oriented development and why they should be involved.
I would say very generally, business owners tend to be one of our more friendly audiences, at least in Highwood. They certainly have a good grasp of the importance of investment versus disinvestment. So there's usually a general pull towards investing and improving and positive impact and positive cycles. I think the challenge gets to be on specific issues once you look at how a specific development might impact parking, which they're used to an existing structure, and change is always difficult for anyone. So I think with the business owners, the proof in that is ultimately the development in your own review process and working through those competing priorities to work through it in the best way possible. But usually they support and trend toward some positive growth and therefore liking and supporting TOD.
Thanks, everyone. I wanted to go back slightly to talk a little bit more about how you might engage residents and how you talk about transit-oriented development more generally, but specifically as it relates to gentrification and displacement. How do you talk about new developments that kind of touch on that subject? How do you describe new developments to maybe acknowledge some concerns among residents? And how do you talk about TOD projects in communities where potentially new growth could lead to a change in the people who are living there? How do you talk about those issues with communities?
Well, we're in a kind of a unique situation, Harvey, having just done the TOD plan. So we did have a lot of public engagement, but it was done during COVID. So it was a weird kind of environment to do public engagement. But we had to, and we did that. So we used a combination of online tools and in fact, I think on two separate occasions, we had back-to-back nights. One night was in person, and then the next night was remote or virtual public forums. And, I think it worked reasonably well. So from just in terms of getting people to participate. And so, you had the supporters and the critics. When you have something new, that always draws different opposing viewpoints on something. And so it's probably not uncommon, whether it's a comp plan, TOD plan, or something else, to get those differing viewpoints. So we definitely got that. But what really was more controversial wasn't the TOD plan per se, but when it starts to result in actual projects where things are looking to be built in the near future. And then people start to get a little nervous, and you get the NIMBY feeling. But that was interesting because, that's when you really have to rely on your city leadership to carry the day and really explain to the public the benefits of that particular project. In this case, the mayor was real helpful in explaining the benefits of some of these projects that would emanate or result from the TOD plan. And as far as gentrification, it's hard to say that it would gentrify, because this building would actually create more what I call workforce housing. And it's the same thing with the YMCA building, which is a senior-oriented building. You're not gentrifying like you are in Lincoln Park or Lakeview or places like that. You're really giving people in the workforce, blue collar, more options for high quality, low cost housing.
I would say we've been having this conversation in Garfield Park. We've been part of a project. I mean, talk about kind of having the transportation infrastructure, like Carlos said, but not having the development. So, and that's the legacy of racism and disinvestment. And that's every reason why people want to have this conversation, because, you know, like there hasn't been investment. There's been a lot of broken promises. There haven't been that community wealth and that community driven development. And so we've been working with a lot of community partners to build a small project, like about 45 units, a small amount of retail halfway between the blue and the green line stations along the Kedzie corridor on the west side, kind of brought into that with elevated partners, Garfield Park Community Council. They have a coalition to stay in Garfield Park. And that's an entirely affordable, deed restricted project, but there's still a lot of anxiety about it because there's a fear of the unknown, and it's not, you know, it's led by outsiders. And I think we dealt with this in Woodlawn too. It took us years for people. The proof is in the pudding. You have to build it. You have to say what you're going to do. It has to be a good project. It has to be well managed. It has to be accessible to people. So we're used to those conversations and not intimidated by them. And I think we understand where it comes from. And I think, you know, I think where a lot of the antidote to that comes, as Nick said, it's elected officials. I think Jason Irvin has been really good as the alderman there, kind of assuring people, saying, look, we need rooftops if we want grocery stores, you know, and there's room in this community for more people. But the reality is, if the majority of the tenure in the neighborhood is low-income renters, people that don't own, everybody knows that that's a tinderbox for displacement. And so I think allying ourselves with leadership, allying ourselves with organizing. I mean, honestly, like the Metropolitan Planning Organization and Institute for Housing Studies did a study, and their antidote to fears of displacement was absolutely not it was not rental housing. I mean, that's what we're doing and that's important, but, you know, we're a shiny new project. You know, maybe it signals to people that the neighborhood is ripe for the wrong kind of investment, and that leads people to leave their home. And so I think, you know, they came up with an amazing plan, and it was all organizing. You know, it's all pressuring the city to get lots in the hands of longtime owners and putting money into existing housing. And so, you know, just really ally ourselves with that group, credence to that group, you know, just kind of giving a mouthpiece to the fact that, like, you know, like the land use and transportation question, it's both and. It's investment in new housing, it's protection of people there, it's building community power, it's a lot of those things. But it's a very real conversation.
I'd say for Skokie, as far as public involvement, we do have, nothing is necessarily TOD specific. We do have every 3 years, we do a citizen survey. So we do get information from our community that way. As far as maybe indirectly TOD would be more of our public meetings, plan commission, appearance commission, village board. But we are embarking on a sustainability plan update. So that's definitely an opportunity to insert the transit-oriented development conversation, grid of streets, that sort of thing. That's, you know, the built environment can naturally help with sustainability.
I've seen a lot of communities do a great job with advertising and reaching out and trying to engage. I think ultimately there's a reality of people with resources and time to provide that feedback are very good at advocating for themselves and what it is that they're looking to be provided with, whereas the people without those resources and time are very capable of doing it, but might just not have those resources or time to do that. So I think it's really important for those that have been with our communities for years, and we've done things like build our connections and networks into those communities the best we can to reach out where we can and do that. I think, you know, sometimes some of the laws and trying to reach out and communicate with people on public hearings and variances are sometimes a little slow, and sometimes we're a little slow to follow those. We still are sending out notices to property owners and not doing that to renters. And that's just one of probably many examples on who are the stakeholders and communities to be notified of some of these types of things, and how can we better reach out and do that. And if I were able to solve that one, I would be doing something probably a little different. It's a real tough one, but I think that's really incumbent on us as we are in these positions longer and are more part of the community to continue to try to reach out and do that the best way we can. But I don't know that we or anyone else has really found that perfect mix yet. It's tough.
Yeah, the G word, as we would call it, and not G for Greater Auburn Gresham Development Corp, but gentrification. That conversation is held quite a bit. And, we certainly feel that when the redevelopment is done from inside out, by local developers, local CDCs, not-for-profits, that community ownership model is the way to stem the tide. So when you have large development partners who are in sync with that line of thinking and vision, like POA is a fantastic example of partnering with local organizations on the ground, like on the southeast side with Claretians and Claretians Associate and others, so that those communities that are deeply rooted and embedded, those organizations and developers that are deeply rooted and embedded in the community have that ownership, have that equity partnership in these large scale development projects, which is, what we're doing in Auburn Gresham. That is, we feel, a recipe for, mitigating gentrification, across the board, we think. But let me just say this, that interestingly enough, I think it was Scott that mentioned this whole notion of parking. And we look at Auburn Gresham. Auburn Gresham is a densely populated community, though we've lost population and much of the south side and Southland has. It is still densely populated, and our homeowners are beginning to age. And so we are really on a push to make certain that we bring in new homeowners, or we try to reduce that out migration that we've seen over the last 20 years. And so making Auburn Gresham and the quality of housing in Auburn Gresham something that is accessible to young families, I think is also essentially important. But these families in Auburn Gresham, though we want more investment, we also want to be able to have access to parking. And sometimes when you're wanting to, build on these vacant lots, there's that tension, that healthy tension. And if you look at some of our Invest Southwest roundtables, you'll get a feeling for that in Auburn Gresham. And so there's a balance, and we're still trying to figure out what that delicate balance is. But it's really interesting to watch this kind of occur. But we're getting there, and this is a critical movement for all of Chicago's South Side.
Thanks, everyone. I think that kind of brings to mind one aspect. I think Nick alluded to it very briefly, just in terms of the NIMBY aspect, not in my backyard. One of the things that a lot of people become concerned about is the idea of density. So how do residents in your communities or the communities that you work with define density generally? Like, when you say that a project is going to be high density, what is the image that is created in people's minds? Do they think of a particular size of building? Do they understand that density could mean, transitioning a single family home lot to maybe a duplex or something like that? How do they think about density generally, and how do you talk about density?
I think there's some confusion between height and density. I think people tend to really focus more on height, and we're building a 5-story structure, and that might scare people. I think people are less resistant to density in the dictionary sense when you're allowing for duplexes, for example, in a single structure. So there's other ways to get to density, and that slide that you shared earlier, Alex, shows that there's townhomes and narrow lot homes that have been done in Skokie and other places. You can create density that way, and those are smart, less obvious ways to get to density. But overall, I think it's very positive, and I think there's a lot of research that shows that density from an economic, but also from a environmental sustainability standpoint, it's a good thing. I think there's different ways to get you to that end goal of density. But yeah, again, I think people get concerned about the height aspect, and I think that was true to some extent in Harvey.
I would ditto that. It seemed our development of 153 units just across the street from Village Hall. I don't think there was as much concern about the number of units, but the overall height, even though it was within the maximum allowed of 156 feet in the specific zoning district it was in. There was definitely a conversation and a few exhibits prepared to show that, well, this building just a block away is not too much shorter than the one that's being proposed. So yeah, I would say density, what comes to mind for me, at least for the community, is height, maybe a little bit of bulk, but more height than, say, maybe number of dwelling units.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, everyone. Michael, I think there are some questions from members of the audience in the chat.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks, Alex. I just thought I'd break in real quick to pose a couple questions to the panelists from the chat box. One is related to Chicago's first TOD ordinance that was put into place nearly 10 years ago. The ordinance reduces parking requirements and allows increased building height and density for new construction in designated areas near transit, public transportation in the city. And the question is, do perhaps you have a similar ordinance or something similar that you could speak to, or have you considered something like that in your communities? Maybe this is more specific for some of the suburban folks, or perhaps Molly and other areas that you've worked on. But anything related to that you might want to speak to?
Yes, in 2017, based on our transit-oriented development plan, RTA actually funded our ability to modify our zoning code, our commercial zoning code, which has TOD components, including reduced parking requirements for TOD. So we are a suburban community, so there is going to be a greater need and demand for cars. So it's not nearly the Chicago version, but it is a mini version of that allows for moving some investment from parking to other aspects of that project that would be more needed considering the transportation available.
And just a special shout out to all the amendments to the ordinance since then, especially for incentivizing bus lines. I mean, again, as Alex's map showed, those bus lines are really important lifeblood of the city. And again, like, you don't need to build parking. A lot of times we have relief anyway for affordable housing, but even then we don't need to build the amount of parking that's usually required under zoning. So that absolutely helps us put dollars into housing.
Skokie is maybe less TOD and more mixed use are the districts in our code. And we do have reduced parking requirements especially in our core mixed use. I find it interesting that, we're talking transit oriented development, but we've had a lot of discussion on parking during this session. But we do have 3 different districts, and come hopefully June 20th, we'll have our zoning district for say our Old Orchard Shopping Center and Village Crossing to the south. We're making some amendments to our B4 district to incorporate residential as well. So it's not a rail hub, but it definitely has bus service, multiple bus service, and we're incorporating residential into that district. And so it'll be our 4th mixed use district called regional mixed use. So I'm excited for that, that change coming up later this month.
Thanks.
One other quick item just to mention, I didn't mention one interesting part of our TOD code allows for a decrease of up to 2 parking spaces with the addition of interior bicycle parking in rooms. So that's, I don't know how much of an incentive that 1 or 2 spaces was. It probably depends a lot on the design of the building, but each building we've had has included that, which I think is ultimately a good thing too.
Yeah, and Scott, we did something similar in Brookfield, parking credits if you had interior bike parking. And it, I think it was helpful to the developers and presumably to the people that ultimately live there too.
Thank you, everybody. Another question, digging a little bit deeper into the gentrification question that we had a moment ago. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. But is there any further in depth that you could go with gentrification? Have you done any research specifically in your communities or looked into gentrification patterns that might be occurring as a result of TOD in your area? Or perhaps conducted any research that could apply to gentrification?
So I don't have anything Highwood specific, and I'm definitely not an academic on these. I think a lot of what we see, just at such a small level, is anecdotal. When you see that the highest price per square foot for a rental goes from $1.80 to $2.50 in a square foot in a relatively small area in a relatively small period of time, you just see some, you have to have some concern on that to know that that could be an impact. It does change if you have, like we have had, either blighted or vacant properties. You're not displacing and therefore you're adding to the housing supply. So there might be less of an impact, but I don't know of necessarily any studies or things that can be used for us specifically.
Yeah, I'm not an expert, but I mean, I think what gets built by the market in places is expensive because that's where developers are going to make a return. So it's like, it's the high rises along the blue line. It's the $700,000 homes in Woodlawn, which, maybe that's a good thing because there's investment, but like that, people who can people that live there already, they can't afford a $700,000 home. So I think it is that perception and yeah, I mean, I think working in Woodlawn with not exactly a community benefits agreement, but the ordinance for housing in Woodlawn has been really interesting. And I think like very thoughtful and balanced, and was hard won on the part of the city and a lot of longtime advocates to make sure that there are tools in place. We just don't let the market run away with that. We don't want every vacant lot to go for a $700,000 house. I mean, I think it's exactly people being on watch and paying attention and making sure that they're partners in the public sector, making sure that the resources go to balanced development that favors, people that have been there for the long term.
As far as Skokie goes, again, probably anecdotal as well. We haven't studied it specifically. So I don't know if the new station has increased reinvestment in unit. We have quite a few kind of a missing middle kind of multifamily area, just within walking distance of our station. So we have a lot of the 2x2 4-unit type buildings. So I know there has been investment in at least maybe one of the units, because some of them are condos, some of them are co-ops where everyone gets owns 25% and lives in one of the units. So I have heard that there has been investment at least in specific units, but I would say from the exterior, I wouldn't necessarily, someone hasn't done all 4, but as a big investment. So, so there might be some anecdotal, but, and I don't even know if it's tied to the station at all, but there's the possibility.
And for people who don't know what that term missing middle means, essentially it describes a type of housing that's in between a single family home and a mid to high rise apartment building. This could be like duplexes or triplexes or even townhomes. And those kind of occupy the type of housing stock that we don't have enough of in the United States compared to single family homes or higher density projects. I wanted to talk a little bit about transit ridership. Or Michael, are there any more questions from the audience?
Yeah, there's just one more. If any of the panelists have any thoughts on land use types that prohibit TOD, or those that are maybe more TOD advantageous. Maybe this ties back into some of the zoning work and kind of redefining land uses in certain zones. Anybody would like to chime in on that?
You know, I would just mention one of the things that we're looking at in Auburn Gresham, and we're really trying to stay up with the times and bring our aging population up with the times, and while being innovative, is as I mentioned, inordinate numbers of vacant lots, vacant buildings that are primed for redevelopment, that we're hoping and expecting that, you know, local developers, CDCs, et cetera, will be a part of those developments. But we're looking at something called a mobility hub. Back to Scott's point about the parking. And so we've got, there's a vacant CVS store that closed pre-pandemic in 2019, for instance, and it's right at the epicenter of our busy 79th and Halsted intersection. And so we're looking at acquiring that as a representing the community, making that a mobility hub, so that, you know, people can connect to this, you know, through many modes of transportation, you know, bicycling, you know, hopefully, you know, residents walking to it or even driving to it, scooters, et cetera. And then the community would own and operate a low carbon, ideally a no carbon shuttle bus that would connect to the metro station, connect to the healthy lifestyle hub, connect to the anaerobic digester, the renewable energy and urban farming campus, connect to the surge of new small businesses and restaurants that are beginning to proliferate due to this this movement that's occurring. And so that's something innovative and creative that we're looking to do, you know, recognizing that, yeah, you know, parking will be, I mean, we're still car centric, and, you know, not having access to parking lots, many of the vacant lots have become de facto parking lots, but really turning this positive into a negative and bringing this healthy, this mobility hub to the center of our community development work is something that we're looking to incorporate.
And I think for even my thought process also is thinking about like living near the station and being able to get to work, but there's also the reverse commute of like bringing people into, say, that transit area for jobs as well, especially with the Illinois Science and Technology Park. I mean, that was a big, more of a reverse commute concept than, you know, maybe people living in Skokie and heading downtown. So definitely kind of, you know, stepping back and kind of thinking about, you know, not only living in the area and having the goods and services that you would want living there, but also maybe being a draw for people outside of the area, also using transit.
One of the things, Alex, we haven't talked too much about is public spaces and placemaking. You know, I think a key part of our new TOD plan, and probably in other TOD plans, is creating a really great gathering space for the public. And I think we got from our consultants a really nice set of plans and strategies to really try to execute on that over the next 5 to 10 years. But I've seen that done in other communities, and when it works, it really works well, I think. I think Evanston's got reinvested in some of their downtown areas for public gathering near Davis Street. They're near their Davis Street Bell station. So I think that's something to look at as part of TOD planning.
Yeah, have any of the other communities that you represent talked about the desire for new public spaces? Or Molly, have you worked on in any communities where that was a major aspect of the project, creating new public space for people to gather and congregate and, you know, be kind of reinforce and foster that sense of community?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess I always go back to the work in Woodlawn. I mean, it's hard to figure, private spaces that are public, it's kind of not the same, but like, I think about the development that was there, which was award-winning in a car-centric era in the late 60s. So that's always very like sobering for developers to come in and, but that like Grove Park had like curb cuts, like 4 every block, and like, it was all concrete, all parking lots, all with, buildings, the brick wall turned to the street. And so when we did that, there's not a single curb cut except the one at the Jewel, and it's all heavily landscaped, and it's wide sidewalks, and it's like a nice place to walk. And not as a lot of storefronts, it doesn't have to be all storefronts to walk, but that's just like, it's a dramatically different street to walk down. And I think that's given people like a lot of life and joy, and kind of people and ownership in the corridor. You can live there and have ownership in the corridor. You can live a few blocks over and have ownership in the corridor. You can visit it. You absolutely cannot call it placemaking, call it lands, but you cannot absolutely underestimate creating nice spaces for people to live and walk and be.
So we have just under 10 minutes left. I wanted to touch on this because we haven't talked about it yet, but I do think it's kind of an undercurrent that we haven't quite addressed yet, but it's at play in what we're talking about today. So in terms of transit ridership, we know that transit ridership was declining even prior to the beginning of the pandemic. What do you attribute that trend to? And also, at least in the region, there have been some changes to fare structures and new passes that seem to, or that have been aiming at that issue, trying to increase ridership. So one example is the Fair Transit for South Cook County pilot, in which fares on the Metro Electric District and the Rock Island lines are reduced by up to 50%, and also Pace increased their service on one of the routes serving that part of the region. So I know, at least anecdotally, that Metra employees have told me that their ridership on Saturdays has eclipsed pre-pandemic numbers. So they're having more riders on Saturdays on the service today than there were before the pandemic. So do you think that these types of efforts will help to attract riders to transit? And what other initiatives do you think might work to help increase people's use of transit for all types of trips, not just work trips?
I guess I'll jump in before Nick does. You've heard me share quite a bit, and much of what I talk about is regional. I think it's so vitally important that we look at our region, and not just, well, certainly in Chicago, not each of the 77 communities. So we are looking regionally about our work, which is why I reference the Southland so regularly, and wanting to make Harvey that hub of the South suburbs like it used to be 50 years ago, whatever that moniker was then. I love the fare reduction that Metra's done. Now, one thing Metra needs to work harder, and if Jim Lewinsky were on the line, I'd tell him, is that the city of Chicago residents on the South Side don't feel Metra. They don't know Metra. We have not been the clientele that Metra serves. And so I think Metra needs to do a very strong, deliberate outreach and PR to get residents in the city of Chicago, South Side, to really understand that Metra is a great ride. And for those of us that are in Zone B, it's essentially the same as a CTA, bus ride. And you can get to downtown Chicago from 87th Street in less than 20 minutes on a Metra line. But some other initiatives, I want to refer back again to this red line extension. I implore everyone on this call to fight with us to get this goddamn red line extension project done. It's ridiculous that the South Side, the largest region of the city, in the Southland, where so many of us are living paycheck to paycheck, don't have the types of public transit or rapid transit access as other areas. And so that red line extension will also help. But marketing, PR to those of us on the south suburb, and I say, I'm so used to saying Southland, but I think that's something that Metro really needs to be deliberate and focused on. I'll yield.
I think when it comes to transit, also, in addition to finding the right price point, is also like frequency of service. I mean, especially on weekends when, you know, it might be an hour between, you know, stops at your station. If you miss it, then, you know, you're waiting, you know, 55 minutes to take the next train, depending on, you know, where you are in the system. And so, you know, frequency of service, whether it's train or bus or that sort of thing, just knowing that if you miss, you know, the last stop, that, you know, maybe in, you know, 6, 8, 10 minutes, you know, another one will come along, and it's not a big hassle if you just a near miss in taking transit.
Thanks, everyone. Michael, are there any more questions from the audience that have come in recently?
No, not at this moment. No additional questions. But just remind anyone, if you would like to voice your question out loud, please feel free to use the raise hand button. We'll try to call on you in the next few minutes.
And Alex, can I just make one more
please.
three-word statement? Universal fare cards.
And kind of related to that, I think I don't know enough about the specifics, but I know that PACE is considering or is in the process of developing a new pass that would work for monthly pass. I think that would work for both PACE and CTA service. So we're starting to see some of that, but it's not as universal or seamless as some other systems elsewhere in the country.
Alex, we do have just you know, a couple comments related to ridership and ridership decline even prior to the pandemic. You know, most recently, fuel prices may be perhaps reversing that, but also just, you know, the competitive nature of the transportation market in the last 10 years and all the many different options for transportation that have come up certainly plays a role and has an impact on transit ridership as well. And then one more question about, can anyone share their thoughts on the Invest Southwest TOD projects? Perhaps Carlos specifically might have a thought to share on that one, since you're doing some great work in one of the Invest Southwest communities.
I will commend Commissioner Cox and DPD and the mayor's office and Deputy Mayor Samir Mayakar and for really being focused on community engagement. It hasn't been, you know, there's been some healthy tension, but after 20 roundtable discussions and the city of Chicago listening to the concerns of the residents and going back to modify and tweak the development projects that they're looking to bring to, you know, right around 79th and Halsted. I will say our community will be, you know, better served as this increased. You see, I'm trying to be really. It's working out. It's working out well. I'm loving the fact that the investment is coming to the city or to the community. The city of Chicago's residents on the South Side have to be at the table and have to remain at the table in all decisions regarding the Invest Southwest development projects. Ideally, as lead developers, or at the, you know, at the very least as investors in these development projects. But I kudos to the city of Chicago for really participating in these difficult conversations.
Thanks, everyone. We're nearing the end of, we just hit 2:30. Not that I was looking at the clock. I wanted to just circle back to one thing I said earlier. I think I was mistaken, and thanks to James for clarifying this in the chat. CTA and PACE have joint single fares and transfers, as well as 7-day and 30-day passes that work on both systems. So just wanted to correct the record on that. I wanted to thank everybody, the panelists, my colleagues, and the attendees to this panel. Thank you for your time and your participation. I really, it wouldn't have been as successful without you. That's to all of the panelists and my colleagues for helping me workshop the slides and change the formatting and everything. So yeah, thanks to everybody for your time and for your participation today. A quick reminder that this is just the first in our Transportation Tuesdays series. So we have webinars occurring for the next handful of weeks on Tuesdays. Next week, I believe, is about signage. We have one about curb management plans, and then we have one about RTAMs, which is our data and project data. So a quick plug to attend those if you're able to. But yeah, thanks so much for everybody for your time and for talking with us today. I thought it was a great discussion.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.